Is this on? Can you guys hear me? I'm Margie Marino. I'm the executive director here at the New Mexico Museum of Natural History and Science. Thank you all for coming out on this chilly October evening. I have had the most fascinating experiences working with the museum to host this drug exhibit. It clearly is something that was needed for our community, and it's been an important point of contact for a lot of people critical to the fight against drug addiction. One of our wonderful privileges was to get a bit of an inside look into the workings of the DEA, which you'll get tonight. I wanted to let everyone know that we are live streaming this presentation, and the live streaming is going through the website at the DEA Museum in Washington, D.C. I think it's a nice crowd for tonight, and so I look forward to hearing all your questions. And I'm sure you're as fascinated as I am for some of the news that we've been hearing lately about the war on drugs. So my job is not to introduce our speaker, but to introduce Juan Peralta. If he would come over here. Juan is the educator that was hired by, paid for by the Drug Administration Museum in Washington, D.C. to be with the exhibit. So when people came to visit the exhibit, they would have someone to talk to. Juan's done a phenomenal job, and I'm going to let him do the honors of introducing our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, or buenas tardes for the Spanish speakers out there. My name is Juan. As Margie mentioned, I am the DEA educator for the exhibit. I have a little tie to the government. I was ex-military, so I spent some time overseas and things like that. So I'm able to have a deeper connection to the exhibit as well as talking to other people as they come in. I've been with the museum and with the exhibit since the summer, and since then we've been able to use I get a lot of use out of the exhibit. We've been able to talk to a lot of school groups, APD groups, and we've had a lot of people come down and try and take advantage of it. And since I've taken over, we have now been able to expand and start reaching out to schools and start presenting to them and letting them know what we're doing, that it is not just an exhibit, but it's an impact and it's a solution to what's been going on, and an eye opener for those people who don't understand what's going on in their own nation. So we've been trying to give back to the community, and we've been trying to work with local organizations and bringing their resources in to distribute to the community, and just trying to do our effort a little bit more rather than just being an exhibit alone. Some events that we have this week is Red Ribbon Week, which goes on through the 23rd to the 31st here at the museum. And it's a tribute to DEA Special Agent Enrique Kiki Camarena, who gave his life protecting our country as well. And throughout this week, you're able to come in, children and families are able to come in and create ofrendas or recuerdos, or kind of give like a message for kids to be able to put that out for people and let them know what they've learned about substance abuse and things like that. Another thing we do have coming up this Saturday, October the 26th, is Drug Take Back Day. So it's national, but here at the museum, we want to do our own as well. And we teamed up with the Albuquerque Police Department to help us make sure that everything goes according to plan. So you guys just come in, you give us your drugs. You give us your drugs, and we'll dispose of them properly. And we'll also be working with the Department of Health. I teamed up with the Department of Health to also distribute to you guys some disposable bags. So if you come in and you forget your drugs, we will give you a bag so you can take with you and put in the remainder of your drugs. And they are environmentally friendly for those out there. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Jacob Prieto. He is the group supervisor for the Albuquerque District Office for the DEA, And I have worked with Jacob as well, and we have teamed up multiple times to help kids and summer programs and things like that, just sharing the message of what we do. So I've worked closely with Jacob. He's a good person, and he is really good at his job. So if we can give him a round of applause, and he's gonna take the floor.
I tend to move around, so I'll try to stay in one spot. My name is Jacob Prieto. Like you said, I am a group supervisor here in Albuquerque. I grew up here in Albuquerque. I went to UNM and I left in '97. Started my career in Washington, D.C. That took me to South America, Hawaii, and now I'm finally back home. It took me 17 years to get back home, but I am really, really glad to be back here. This is my home. I'm glad to be here in this fight and fighting for my community. And I love talking at these talks. I love talking with the public. I love hearing your questions because it keeps inspiring me. But one question I always get is the war on drugs. The war on drugs. Why are we doing this war on drugs? Is it worth it? I hope those of you who have seen the museum, Drugs and Consequences, which you have right outside these doors, have taken a look at it and actually taken that one word, consequences. And if you look at that and you walk through it, you can see that sometimes people don't understand. These substances are so powerful, they can corrupt an entire nation. They can destroy our lands. With these illegal laboratories, they're actually polluting and destroying species. People don't realize that. But the worst thing they do is when they seep into our communities and into our families, they destroy all of it. There's not a substance that can take a son and make him go and steal from his mother. A substance that can take a family and rip it apart. Make a young woman sell her body in the streets just to get some more drugs. So my answer is yes, we do need to be in this fight. And we need to continue this fight. Are we winning this war? We're not winning this war. It's not worth it. Well, like every war, you don't measure it by the entire war, you measure it by the battles. And anyone that's actually been in a war can tell you, you fight for that person that's next to you. So I'm here fighting for that family that needs justice, that community that is being ravaged by drugs. That's how you measure it. You fight valiantly for that small victory, and you put those small victories together, and you are winning the fight. That's how you measure a battle when you're in a war. And it gives me great honor to be here to introduce one of the greatest warriors we have in DEA, one of our highest decorated DEA agents. I have to get out my notes because his career is quite impressive. But like I said, 31 years at the DEA. He has served 13 years in Mexico, 2 years in the Caribbean. He was the SAC of the Caribbean Division, which is actually in charge of that division. San Diego, he was the SAC. He was also the chief of operations for our international division. That is, we have the biggest footprint around the world, and this man was in charge of that. He had also developed some of these programs, such as our Operation Containment, which bring together 25 countries, the Centers for our Drug Intelligence, which helps all these agencies talk together, which is so important that we do that. He's also from here. You may recognize him from TV. He is also, if you want to hear about some of his other successes, he has authored Deal, and and three others. So it's very proud. One of my mentors. I'm very proud to introduce from Espanola, New Mexico, Michael Vigil.
Thanks, Jacob. Well, it's a pleasure to be here tonight. I got a call from individuals from the museum about a month ago, and they said, would you be willing to come and give a talk at the museum relative to the drug problems and what have you? I said I'd be honored. And I recently moved back to New Mexico after a very lengthy illness. I came here about a year and a half ago, and I got deathly ill. I was hospitalized here in Albuquerque for about 3.5 months. And when I was released, I knew exactly how Papillon felt when he escaped from Devil's Island. But Anyway, going back to what Jacob was saying, I don't believe in the title of war on drugs because all wars have an end. This is not one that we're going to see an end to in, at least not in my lifetime, and probably not in yours. I look at it more as a permanent campaign against drugs, simply because we still have a great demand here in the United States, and it's this demand that basically drives the supply. As long as we have that demand, if it's not Mexico, if it's not Colombia, if it's not Afghanistan, it's going to be another country, because we suffer from the balloon effect where you squeeze one area and the balloon will pop out between your fingers and the problem will be generated someplace else. I grew up in Espanola, as Jacob said. I'm a very proud son of New Mexico, and I'm so glad to be back in New Mexico, simply because when I was in Washington, D.C., I didn't have access to great northern New Mexico food. And the best Mexican restaurant in the D.C. area was Taco Bell. So anyway, I started my career here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I was a very young kid when I came out of the DEA Academy. In fact, I was the youngest one to go through the academy. Came to Albuquerque, and I was immediately thrust into undercover roles. I had never used drugs. I had never seen drugs. And I started to work undercover, buying heroin, buying cocaine. And it served me well because I used my knowledge here in Albuquerque as a trampoline. But shortly after arriving back in Albuquerque, I was sent TDY to Denver, Colorado to work on one of the top 10 heroin distributors in the country, an individual by the name of James Orlando Quintana. He was a huge distributor of heroin, had been in prison and had recently gotten out, and he started back into the heroin trade. So we started to try to penetrate his organization, and we identified an individual in a prison that we got out. He made an introduction, and the individual that he introduced me to started to sell me heroin. But I couldn't work my way any further up because the individual that I was buying heroin from didn't want to lose me as a customer. So I went to a bar one evening when we spotted one of the top lieutenants for James Orlando Quintana. And I walked in and I started to play the high roller. I started to buy drinks for everybody at the bar. Probably cost the government about $2,000. But anyway, I started to talk to him after the bar cleared and started to negotiate with him. Then they started to check me out. But I finally met James Orlando Quintana and Isaac Rubali, who was his lieutenant. And I came up with the idea of using diamonds because I knew James Orlando Quintana loved diamonds. And he had his fingers covered in, rings with diamonds. And so I went to a jeweler and he gave me several diamond rings. I met with Quintana, didn't like the diamond rings because the diamonds were too small. So I went back, got some bigger ones, and eventually I did a deal. We had a truck parked in the back of Quintana's house, and we started to record everything because we had a video camera. I was wearing a wire, and we finally were able to arrest them. After my tenure here, I went to the Mexican border, Nogales, and the Mexican drug trafficking organizations at that time were starting to develop, and there was only one major cartel at that time, and that was the Guadalajara cartel. But I would go into Mexico alone, no backup. I wouldn't even tell the Mexican government that I was there, simply because the corruption was endemic, and I couldn't take the chance that they would compromise my identity, put me at risk, or put the informant that I was potentially working with at risk as well. So I would go into Mexico and deal with a lot of these traffickers, and it got to the point where all the traffickers in Nogales, Sonora, Mexico, which was on the other side of the international fence, started to know or think that I was a major trafficker. So I would be talking to one trafficker, another one would come up and he would say, Don Miguel, and I'd say, hey, wait at the restaurant, I'll be right there. Finish the deal, go and do another deal. But it was a very dangerous time. The corruption there was endemic, and you just could not really trust the federal police or the counterparts because of that endemic corruption. And that endemic corruption actually started as a result of the fact that the PRI, or the Revolutionary Institutional Party, which dominated politics in Mexico from 1929 to 2000, created this just massive corruption that went on decade after decade after decade. And as a result of that, the proliferation of drug trafficking in Mexico, started to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Later, I transferred to Hermosillo, Sonora, Mexico, and I started to work undercover there as well. I remember going to meet drug traffickers at one of my favorite restaurants, and I still remember the name. It was called the Trocadero, and they had the best milanesa on the planet. And I would go there simply because, I take advantage of the fact that I was doing work, but at the same time I wanted to, enjoy a little bit of life's little pleasures. So I would go in there, negotiate with these bad guys, and then I would give the signal, and all the Mexican federales would come in, make the arrest. And this was going on almost every week. So after a while, these waiters at the restaurant would see me coming in, and then they would just kind of sit back or stand in a corner and start to whisper and just wait for the feds to come in. And I know what you're all thinking is, did you pay for the meals? I did. I would send somebody in later on to make the payment. But in Hermosillo, I started to work throughout Mexico in terms of doing undercover buys. At that time, black tar heroin was very prevalent. We had issues with marijuana, and so one thing that I learned working undercover is you have to expect the unexpected. And I remember on one occasion, I went to the cradle of Mexican drug trafficking, which was the state of Sinaloa. The state of Sinaloa has probably spawned, I would say, at least 85% of all the major drug traffickers that Mexico has ever had. Went there, I had 2 informants. I advised them to go meet with the bad guys and get a sample of heroin, simply because, as an undercover agent, you not only ran the risk of getting killed by the drug traffickers, but there was also a situation where you could get ripped off by other individuals. So I'm in the hotel room with one of the Mex feds, and there's a knock on the door. I look out through the peephole and I see about 6 or 7 individuals standing outside. I open the door and they're all armed. They've all got handguns in their waistband. And I told them, I said, just one of you come in. So one of them comes in and he says, Don Miguel, and he grabs my back. And I know he's felt my gun. And he sits down across from me and he starts to jibber jabber. By that time he's nervous because he thinks I'm probably going to kill him. And probably I would have. But anyway, he starts to talk, and I couldn't understand what he was saying because he was just going around in circles. So I said, well, I better end it, and I pulled out my gun and stuck it in his mouth. And we put him on the ground. And at that point in time, I charged out the door, and I figured if these guys go for their weapons, I'll probably be able to take out maybe 3 of them, but not all of them. And fortunately, they didn't, lay them on the floor, and they were all state judicial police officers. And they felt that I was a legitimate drug trafficker, and they wanted to come in and extort money from me. So anyway, they all ended up going to prison. And so those were the things that would take place. And one of the other things that I did there is I had an undercover operation where I met with some drug traffickers that we used to work with. Rafael Caro Quintero, a major player within the Guadalajara cartel. And I'll talk a little bit more about the Guadalajara cartel shortly. But I met with them, and Caro Quintero was a major marijuana trafficker. I was able to borrow a truck with a big camper shell from the Mex Feds. And I met with them initially at this restaurant, and I told them that I'd be back with the money and I'd come to pick up the load in a couple of weeks. So here we go, down this narrow two-lane highway. The sun's beating down. You can see the heat wave just bouncing off the asphalt highway. And the feds didn't have any training, and they had even less patience. So I go into the restaurant, and I didn't have enough money, or a flash roll as we call it, to show these individuals. So what I did is I took a bunch of $1 bills and I put $100 bills on each side, wrapped them around my ankles so that they couldn't thumb through them. Going to the restaurant, these guys come in, with their cowboy hats, their cowboy boots, their big gold belt buckles. And one of them tells me, he says, give me the keys to the truck. And he says, I'm going to take this man, which was the informant. And I stayed with the other trafficker in this restaurant, which was a combination restaurant gas station. So an hour goes by, and this guy is telling me in Spanish, si eres federal, te vamos a desplumar, which in essence is if you're a federal agent, we're going to kill you. So he's going on and on and on. Another hour goes by, 2 hours, 3 hours, starts to get dark. And I'm looking out the window, this trafficker's looking at me, and I see one of the Mex Feds go like this from the window, and I'm thinking, do you really expect me to answer you? When this guy's threatening to kill me, and so anyway, the trafficker tells me that he's going to go to the restroom, and it's an outdoor restroom. And he walks out, and I figure, well, I better go out and be there because something's going to go wrong. And sure enough, one of the Mex Feds comes and sticks his gun right on his chest. Now he grabs the barrel. He's got leverage. So he pushes it back, gun goes off, hits the Mex Fed right in the head, and all I see is a blood red mist just go up in the air. And he turns to me and probably from a distance of 3 feet fires 2 shots, and I could feel the bullets whiz by my head. Return fire, he takes 2 shots in the chest, falls, and somebody calls the Cruz Roja or the Red Cross, and now it's pandemonium. A lot of people milling around. You know, the feds are, you know, in the area with machine guns. And sure enough, you know, a few minutes later, here comes this truck around the corner with our truck with the informant and the bad guy. He pulls in, sees all the feds with the machine guns, and he steps on it. And he clips the camper shell on the back of a semi truck, and it twists around. The feds give chase, and as the trafficker negotiates a curb, you know, he jumps off, but he hits the informant over the head with the barrel of his handgun. Fortunately, it didn't kill him, but it was a horrible night of violence. And that is what you have to expect. And one of the things that I learned is that regardless of how dangerous it was, you have to remain deadly calm. If you lost your cool and you panic, at that point in time, you're going to make mistakes, and those mistakes would probably cost you your lives. So did a lot of undercover work there. From Mexico, I went to Colombia during the heyday of Pablo Escobar. And Colombia at that time was basically dominated by the Medellin cartel and then also the Cali cartel. Pablo Escobar started off as a common criminal, and he would forge certificates for, you know, high school and college. So if any of you want them, they're still available for $50. So, but anyway, then he met an individual by the name of Alvaro Prieto, and Alvaro Prieto, you know, sold domestic appliances. He was a smuggler, not a drug smuggler, but cigarettes and what have you. And Pablo Escobar started to make big money. Then he saw some of the drug barons in Colombia that were making even more money by selling cocaine. So he had his mother create a vest where he could stick small amounts of cocaine, and he would go to Peru and buy the cocaine or cocaine paste or base, and then bring it back to Colombia, where it was processed with ether and other precursor chemicals into cocaine hydrochloride. He starts off small, just like every other trafficker. Then he starts to deal in very large quantities. And we estimate that he was probably making about $20, $30 million a month in terms of the cocaine distribution, and eventually started to control 80% of the cocaine that was coming into the United States. He became a very vicious man. He was pretty much a monster. And I would sit maybe about 3 or 4 feet from him at soccer games. And if you saw Pablo Escobar, you would say to yourself, you know, this guy looks like a regular street gang that you would find in Albuquerque. And he would always wear, you know, like a cheap, I don't want to offend anybody here, a cheap velour shirt with blue jeans, but he always had immaculate white tennis shoes. They were clean as a whistle. Nothing ostentatious, no jewelry, nothing. And the sicarios, or the hitmen, his bodyguards that were with them, they looked like a bunch of, major, just gang members, just. But they brought Colombia down to its knees, because when Colombia decided that they were going to start extraditing criminals to the United States, Pablo Escobar went to war against the government. And he, at one time, paid the M19 subversive organization. It's now defunct. But he paid him about $2 million to go to the Justice Building. And they went in there, and the Colombian government responded in kind, and they sent the military in there with tanks. I was in Bogota during that whole siege, and it sounded like a military war. The tanks were just, bashing in the doors. Soldiers were going in. There was automatic gunfire. And the M19 started to set fire to all the records there to try to basically obstruct the extradition of these drug traffickers to the United States. And Colombia lost at least 11 justices, during that siege. All the M19 members were killed. But that goes to show, how violent Pablo Escobar was. Then he started a war with General Miguel Maza, who was the head of DAS, which is their version of like immigration, FBI, and some of our other agencies. And he disliked Miguel Maza with a passion. So what does he do? He gets a vehicle with about 500 kilograms of explosives. He parks the car in front of the DAS building and detonates it. And it almost shreds the building in front. There's a huge crater, kills, I believe, about 50 people, wounds many, many others. And that is when Pablo Escobar started to become a narco-terrorist. He was much more than a drug trafficker. He was a terrorist. And he became the alternate senator or representative for the state or Department of Antioquia, as they call it there. And he was denounced by Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, who was the Minister of Justice for the Colombian government. He was basically ousted, and at that point in time, he put out a contract on Lara Bonilla. Lara Bonilla, one evening, is leaving in his office. He knows that there's a contract out on him. He's got a lead car, his car, and a follow car, all full of bodyguards. Lara Bonilla is sitting in the back on the rear right, and all of a sudden there's a motorcycle that starts tracking that little convoy. Motorcycle passes the car in behind and then weaves its way to where Lara Bonilla was sitting, and then using an Israeli-made fully automatic Uzi, fires 8 rounds, and the bullets stitch Lara Bonilla from head all the way down to his shoulders, and he's killed immediately. Motorcycle takes off, passes all the cars, and tries to negotiate a very sharp turn, and the motorcycle overturns. The shooter gets up and starts to fire at the bodyguards. Bodyguards return fire, and he drops. They capture the driver. The shooter was 16 years old, and the driver of that motorcycle was 19 years old. That would be like two teenagers killing the Attorney General of the United States. Then and there, Luis Carlos Galan was the presidential candidate at that time, and he was going to be the next president of Colombia. But, you know, he denounced drug trafficking. He denounced Pablo Escobar, and that was good enough for Pablo Escobar to put out a contract on him. Carlos Galan goes to give a speech. He gets up on a podium, on a stand, and this guy walks up with a fully automatic Mac 10 and just sprays him with bullets and kills him. Pablo Escobar stated that, you know, he preferred a tomb in Colombia rather than a prison cell in the United States. Later, he gives himself up to the government because the government decides that they're going to give him the deal of the century. And what they do is they tell him, if you admit to some of your crimes, we will not extradite you to the United States, number one, and we'll put you in, you know, a prison. And Pablo Escobar decides to take it because they're giving him 5 years. Then he builds La Catedral, which is a prison that he builds, you know, with jacuzzis, with rec rooms, with pool tables, with bars, with discotheques, and a soccer field. And the electrical switch that electrifies the fence around the prison is in Pablo Escobar's room. So, you know, he flips it on in, you know, at night, and, you know, he's got all his girlfriends coming in to see him, and the guards are actually paid by Pablo Escobar. He pays the guards. So the guards are his protective service, not the government's, you know, correctional officers. One day, Pablo Escobar decides that he's going to have a meeting with some of his associates, the Galeano, one of the Galeano brothers and Moncada brother. He brings them to the prison to see him, and he starts to accuse him that they're stealing money from him. They deny it, and he has them executed right there. They build a bonfire with wood, scrap wood, and then they torch him, and then they bury him into the soccer field, which literally became a cemetery within the prison. The United States starts to basically put a lot of pressure on the Colombian government, and they said, you know, hey, this is not working out. You know, this guy's still controlling his organization. And the Colombian government decides, okay, well, we're going to send a group of military to get him out of there and move him someplace else. Well, Pablo Escobar doesn't want to go someplace else because, you know, he has control here. They move him someplace else, he's not going to have any control. So instead of going in there full force, you know, they send one guy in there, and Pablo Escobar immediately takes him hostage and threatens to kill him. Fortunately, he doesn't, and he makes his getaway with some of his underlings. And later, he's trying to negotiate an agreement with the Colombian government to give himself up. But by that time, we had brought in resources, you know, Centra Spike, you know, we had Delta, we had members from Special Operations Command, you know, with aircraft that, you know, had monitoring equipment. We already had his radio frequencies. But one of the things that Pablo Escobar did is that, you know, he would never stay on the radio for more than 5 minutes, so that, you know, it could not be triangulated. And now he is, because of the killings of the Moncada and Galeano, Pepes is created. And you know what Pepes is, right? People persecuted by Pablo Escobar, all his enemies. And it's actually them that started to destroy Escobar's infrastructure. They started to go after killing his associates, killing his attorneys, killing anybody that was associated with Pablo Escobar. So started to just basically destroy the foundation for the Medellin cartel. And Pablo Escobar was now deathly afraid because they were going to start going after his family. And he tried to get him to Germany, but we coordinated with the German authorities and they didn't let him into the country. So they came back. And one day he's talking to his son on the radio, and he stays on a little bit too long. And one of the captains from Martinez, from the Colombian National Police, is in a vehicle going down an area which includes tract housing. And he's with this equipment, but you know, he can't get a read because there's water there. The houses are, basically, connected to one another. But he looks up and he sees Pablo Escobar on a window, looking down, talking on the phone. So he sees him, and immediately the Colombian National Police surround the house. And as they start to go in, Escobar's bodyguard, El Limon, as they called him, gets killed upon the initial entry. Pablo Escobar is on the second floor. He tells his son, he says, listen, there's something going on here. Let me call you right back. He sees Limon lying at the base of the stairs, dead. So he opens up the window on the second floor and jumps out into the roof. And he thinks that there's people coming through the window, so he starts shooting at the window. And at that time, the Colombian National Police, they were on the ground, all fire. And several bullets hit him. The one that killed him, hit him in the ear, and it, went through his brain. But this man, with his little motley crew of sicarios, literally brought Colombia down to its knees in terms of extradition. And the cocaine still continues to flow from Colombia. When Manuel Santos, the former president of Colombia, he decided that he was going to suspend the eradication program because he felt that glyphosate, could cause cancer, so he wanted to do a study on that. So as soon as he suspended the eradication, the cultivation of coca plants just went through the roof. And many years before that, it was Peru that was number one. It was Bolivia that was number two, and then Colombia number three in terms of production. But then, it started to kind of shift between Colombia and Peru. But then it finally settled into Colombia because, the Colombians could grow it, especially in the southern regions. And then they had the protection of the Armed Revolutionary Forces of Colombia. And they would protect it. They would protect their airfields and what have you. And then later, the FARC stopped receiving funding from Cuba because Cuba's economy was, basically down the tubes. So the end justified the means, and that's when they decided that they were going to become full-fledged drug traffickers. The hell with protection, we can make a hell of a lot more money. And the Colombian government, at one time told the FARC that they wanted to start peace negotiations, so they gave them a protected zone. And within a very short time, they had built communications towers. They had laboratories all over the place. And we finally had to send in a combination force of police and military, and they seized like 5 tons of cocaine, destroyed the towers. Well, since then, Juan Manuel Santos was able to negotiate a peace accord with the FARC, which the process began in 2012, and they were finally able to get them to sign an agreement. The big problem is that the FARC had already tasted wealth. So they gave up their arms and started producing cocaine and started building laboratories. And one of the primary routes for their cocaine is now Venezuela, with Maduro, Nicolas Maduro, who's the current, I would say, dictator. But they're funneling tens of tons of cocaine from Colombia into Venezuela, then from Venezuela into the United States, and then also to Europe. And really, the rule of law is gone in Venezuela, so it's a very convenient place. And how many of you have heard of the Cartel of the Suns, or Cartel of the Soles? The Cartel of the Soles is a loose-knit group of government officials, and they call them Cartel of the Suns. It's really not a cartel, but it's government officials. And a lot of them are generals, and they wear this sun insignia. Our generals wear stars. They wear suns. And they have really started to work with FARC members and other Colombian drug trafficking groups to move drugs into Venezuela and to other areas. And Nicolas Maduro basically protects all these drug traffickers, and we've indicted many of them here in the United States. But, Maduro protects them, and they protect Maduro. So it's a quid pro quo in terms of what's going on there as well. I could go on and talk to you forever, but how many of you have heard what happened here last Thursday in Culiacan, Mexico? What did you think of that? Basically, the Mexican government went into the cradle of the Sinaloa cartel, which is the state of Sinaloa, and the capital of that state is Culiacan. And initially, the Mexican government indicated that this group of about 30 members of what they call the National Guard, which Andrés López Obrador created, that they came under attack by 4 individuals in a house. And I knew that wasn't true. Because, who in their right mind is going to attack a much larger force when you could just let it go by? They actually captured Ovidio Guzman, who is the son of Chapo Guzman. And it appears that they may have also captured Ivan Archibaldo, who is the other son of Chapo Guzman. But immediately, all these Sinaloa cartel gunmen came in trucks, like dump trucks, with 50 caliber machine guns mounted on them. AK-47s, fully automatic, and they started to burn buses at the entrances to the city of about 750,000 people. And they paralyzed the city. They started to shoot at buildings. I thought they were going to kill a hell of a lot more, but they killed about 8 people and wounded many, many others. So what came to mind, and I was interviewed probably about 6 times that night, and I've been interviewed since that whole incident by the media. And they said, well, what's your take on it? And I said, my take on it is that, the Sinaloa cartel has the capability of bringing the Mexican government to its knees. And López Obrador, when he took over as president about a year ago, he came up with this strategy of abrazos y no balazos. You know what that means? Correct, or hugs, not gunshots. And his objective, primary objective, was to minimize violence. But it had the opposite effect because it emboldened these cartels because, he didn't want to attack them. And I can understand that because when Felipe Calderón became president of Mexico in 2006, he started the kingpin strategy where they started to go after the leaders of these cartels, which was not a good strategy either, because what happened is they captured many of the cartel leaders, but the cartels fragmented and they became many. Now they started to vie and fight against each other for power and control of territory. And that has led to so much violence that since 2006 to the present time, we estimate that there are easily 200,000 people that have lost their lives in Mexico. And I look at Mexico as a land of like a giant cemetery, and there's who knows how many thousands of unmarked cemeteries throughout the country. And I feel sorry for the citizens of Mexico because they're very, they're innocent. But, when these cartels go to war against each other, there's a lot of innocent lives that are lost. And it's not Mexico's fault, because the thing is that if it weren't for our demand here, we would not be involved in this whole, horrific situation that afflicts, our country and Mexico. Let me talk to you a little bit about the opioid problem. The United States comprises about 5% of the world's total population. Yet, we consume about 85% of the world's total opioids. And if you include Canada and some Western European countries, that number rises to about 95%. China produces, I would say, 80% of the world's synthetic opioids, primarily carfentanil, which is an animal tranquilizer, and it's about 1,000 times stronger than heroin. If you took a few grains of salt, and if it were like fentanyl, it would kill you immediately. And they also produce fentanyl, which is 100 times stronger than heroin. And we work with China in terms of trying to bring this under control, because they would play whack-a-mole with all these thousands of laboratories throughout China that were producing these opioids. And once they brought a substance under control, the laboratories would change the molecular structure of fentanyl, which meant that the Chinese government then had to try to bring that under control, and it would take them anywhere from 8 months to a year to be able to do so. This past May, the Chinese president decided that he was going to control all fentanyl, all opioids, instead of, going, from one analog to another. But that's never going to be able to control it because China doesn't have the resources, the inspectors to be able to go to all these laboratories and inspect them and make sure that they're complying with Chinese law. And I remember I had to give a talk with Chinese global television on opioids, and I did a little research on the internet, and I found out that, I could order, fentanyl online from China for about, less than $10,000 a kilo. And these laboratories in China will help you smuggle the fentanyl into the United States, and they do it by way of the U.S. Postal Service. And they don't go with FedEx or with UPS because they register and they track their packages. Now, the U.S. Postal Service has started to do that, but they're a long ways of doing it. Meantime, the Mexican cartels, being the astute businessmen that they are, have started to import both finished fentanyl and the precursor chemicals. So now they're manufacturing fentanyl, and we started to see a lot of seizures at the border. And it makes sense for them. Why? Because they don't have to grow huge opium poppy fields that could be eradicated. They don't take the risk of having massive laboratories. With a few chemicals, you can produce fentanyl, and fentanyl right now is in popular demand, but it was not the Chinese or the Mexicans that started this opioid crisis. Ground zero for the opioid crisis was Purdue Pharma. And it was Purdue Pharma was called Purdue Frederick, and it was purchased in 1948 by three brothers who were actually psychologists at a mental hospital in Queens. But in 1995, they produced OxyContin. And in 1996, the Food and Drug Administration gave them authorization, and they started to aggressively market the drug. And they prepared a database before the advent of big data. And they started to see which doctors around the country prescribed the most prescription drugs. And they sent out representatives, and they told the doctors, look, this is not addictive. It's time released. And so they really marketed this thing. And before you knew it, this OxyContin became a major problem. DEA started to pursue Purdue Pharma, and then guess who Purdue Pharma hired as its representative? The vampire Rudy Giuliani. And this was right after 9/11. And so you've seen all of the lawsuits around the country. But here's the kicker, here's the kicker, is that Chapo Guzman is brought into courtrooms in handcuffs and shackles. These guys from these pharmaceutical companies who have probably killed more people than Chapo Guzman ever dreamed of show up in civil court in their Giorgio Armani suits, in stretch limos, and after having made billions of dollars, what do? They pay a pittance, they pay $400 million to them. No, that's nothing. That's pocket change. So they continue to do the same thing. And in my hometown of Espanola, there's a little Walgreens at one of the busiest intersections. And within probably less than a decade, in a little village of maybe 10,000 people, they prescribed and dispensed 6.1 million opioid pills. And that's not only Espanola, but here in Albuquerque, you have the same type of situation. And this problem is only going to get worse. The current administration, under its omnibus crime bill, dedicated $3 billion for this problem of opioids. But that's nowhere near enough. It's probably more like $30 billion that have to be spent. And for Christ's sake, for AIDS treatment, they've given 18 billion, but for the biggest epidemic that has ever engulfed our country, $3 million is a drop in the bucket, and it's not going to solve anything. So it's a horrible situation. But one of the things that we really need to do is we need to have a strategy that deals with treatment. And it's not sending people to these treatment facilities and drawing them out and then releasing them to go back to the same neighborhoods, to the same people that got them addicted. We need to do follow-up. And the thing is that we need to reduce the demand, and we need to talk to our kids. And it's not only, it's not a law enforcement problem in of itself. You need the families, you need the religious institutions, you need the schools, and we need to educate these kids at a very early age. Because if not, and they're gripped into this tragic cycle of drug abuse, chances are that they're probably, they may never ever make it out. So now that I've tried to brighten your day, I'm going to open it up to questions and yes, sir. Well, the Food and Drug Administration was convinced by Purdue Pharma, the Sackler family, that it was a time release type of opioid, which minimized, the addiction properties. So they basically, in essence, fooled the Food and Drug Administration that it was, very the addictive properties were very minimal, and in reality they were really, really high. I went by Donald Trump. No, No, I actually went by Miguel. And the reason that I use, I didn't go by Mike because most of my work was in Latin America. But I would always use my real first name because you never knew who you were going to run into while in, with the drug traffickers. And if somebody came and you're telling these guys that you're Mike or Miguel, somebody comes in and says, oh, hey, not good. Joe. Uh, thanks. Yeah. Ah,
I know that you always talk about how creating the demand is one way to kind of control this drug issue. As far as like for Mexico, what, in your opinion, what do you think is the solution for the government to do in order to control all the violence?
well, the thing is that I think that the violence in Mexico is going to continue until we reduce the demand here. Because if we reduce the demand here, the supply is going to be reduced. I think that Mexico or Lopez Obrador, the current president, needs to get together with all its governors from the different states, all of the police forces, federal, state, local, and then also the military, and then the intelligence service, CISEN, and create a strategy that is going to work. And it can't be a kingpin strategy because that's been a horrific failure. You have to do a top to bottom demobilization or demolishing of these drug cartels. And it also requires the United States to participate because we do provide them with Plan Merida funding, which is equipment, it's training, and then it's also intelligence. A lot of the operations that take place in Mexico are generated by U.S. intelligence. There's a question up there. Can you speak a little bit louder? I'm sorry. Well, when I graduated from high school in Española, I went to New Mexico State University, and I graduated with a degree in criminology, police science, and then I started to apply to different agencies, and the one that really piqued my interest was DEA because CIA has a mandate to primarily work foreign, FBI domestic. But we had a charter to work both foreign and domestic. And then I thought that pitting my intelligence and my cunning against some of the most violent and cunning criminals in the world would be fascinating, and that's why I decided to go into the DEA. Well, there's a lot of individuals, and there's a lot of law enforcement individuals here that have really done a great job for our country. In fact, law enforcement, intelligence, whatever, if you'll take a stand up. But these are heroes. Yes, sir. Well, the corruption on the border is no different than it is in the interior of Mexico. And when you have cartels that are generating billions of dollars, it's very easy to corrupt people that are weak on both sides of the border, and it's happened on both sides of the border. The other issue that you talk about is jobs. There's a lot of poor areas in Mexico where there's no job opportunities. One of the things that Lopez Obrador wants to do is he wants to develop those areas to provide jobs because he feels that by providing jobs, it may reduce the drug activity. I don't know if at this point in time it's going to work because there's no jobs that the government could provide that are going to generate the same amount of money that you get from the drug trade. And a lot of these individuals, like Chapo Guzman, when he grew up in Badiraguato in the municipality of La Tuna, Sinaloa, he used to sell oranges and bread that his mother made. So these individuals, these young boys, they see these drug traffickers in very luxurious cars, with gold bracelets, diamonds, and beautiful women. So they become the drug trafficker, the role models or the paragons of these young kids. That's where the problem lies. Well, it is. It has started to become public information because the DEA has a database where they track these pills. And I believe it was the Washington Post that started to print or disclose the number of opioid pills that were being put out into the open market. One of the problems lies in the fact that, like Purdue Pharma and others, they give millions of dollars through their lobbyists to fund campaigns of U.S. congressmen, and there's a reluctance in terms of going after these individuals criminally, and that's what they need to do. They are probably worse than Chapo Guzman. The methamphetamine problem still exists. The cartels in Mexico are also producing methamphetamine, and that is a pretty sought after drug here in the United States. And I will tell you that the cartels many years ago they trafficked drugs and what have you, but what is now making them even more resilient is the fact that they have created a new business model. And not only do they traffic methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin, marijuana, now opioids, but they also engage in extortion. They engage in kidnappings. And one of their most lucrative criminal areas is siphoning petroleum out of Mexico or Pemex's pipelines. And like one drug trafficker said, not everybody uses drugs, but everybody uses petroleum. And Mexico is losing billions of dollars annually in terms of petroleum loss. But methamphetamine continues to be a drug of choice. Yes. There's so many ways of laundering money. For example, we had the Sinaloa cartel that was laundering money through Wachovia Bank, that is now part of Wells Fargo. And they laundered billions of dollars through Wachovia. And they would deposit hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they would put them in boxes that would fit perfectly underneath the teller's window. Then they would use casas de cambio, or money exchange houses, that were not very well controlled, and they had one key property, and that was the ability to wire transfer money. And the casas de cambio would wire transfer into these banks. And then they had, I forget I always lose my mind in terms of the acronym, but I think it's BSBC Bank. BSBC Bank. But they laundered several billions of dollars. The Sinaloa cartel, as well as other cartels, they buy properties. They buy and they put them under testaferros, or straw purchasers, and they use these offshore banks. So there's many ways of laundering money. They would go into Los Angeles, into the clothing district, buy clothes with drug money, and then take it into Mexico, and then even increase their profit margin. So the problem with Mexico is that their asset forfeiture laws are very weak. We had a governor by the name of Mario Villanueva, and we seized, I think, over $100 million in assets, properties from him. And then in the end, all of that reverted back to him because Mexico's laws were very weak.
One example in the money laundering part of it, Western Union was not controlling or tracking monies that were being wired from individuals from in the United States to Mexico and other countries. And basically, the Attorney General from Arizona negotiated a civil fine where they paid, I believe, $60–80 million to the state government of the 4 border states, and that's how the Attorney General's office here, not this Attorney General, but the prior one, started this thing called Border Organization for Money Laundering, and that's how they financed it, because they got a piece of that fine. Arizona was nice enough to share with the 3 other border states, and I believe that New Mexico's portion was something about the $20 million range that we got, where that organization, of course, that money's running out now, so now they have to avoid some of the things that that unit is doing here at the Attorney General's office. But I wanted Mike to share, I've gone to several of Mike's talks, and something that's really astounding is the fact that the obstacles that being well-trained individuals in Mexico law enforcement evidence. Uh, Mike has mentioned, and I'd like Mike to talk a little bit about that. That for every 100 arrests, they have successful prosecutions of about 3%. 3 out of every 100 cases that are worked, they
Not
might
not
be
not
able
of
to
every 100
prosecute.
cases, it's 3% of all cases.
Yeah, of all. So if you talk about that, I mean, when you have that kind of a percentage, I was a director of tax fraud here. The state of New Mexico created that. 86 out of our 87 cases while I was there, 98% successful prosecution rate that went through the entire judicial process. 98%. IRS had a 90% successful prosecution rate. Now you're talking 3%. Could you talk that? I know Mike's really much into wanting to get some training into the law enforcement people in Mexico.
But the thing is that Alvin is right, is that in Mexico, most of the crimes go unreported because the people just don't have the confidence in the judiciary in Mexico, and they probably prosecute maybe 3 to 5% of all criminal cases. And even then, it's going to be questionable as to whether these criminals go to jail. Now, there are several factors for that. And one of them is that, again, when Felipe Calderon became president in 2006, instead of using the federal judicial police, he started to use the Mexican Marines. Well, the Mexican Marines are military, and they do a very, very good job in terms of military actions and what have you, but they're not investigators. They're not trained in investigations. They're not trained in being able to identify evidence and be able to collect it and preserve it. And I remember meeting with the Attorney General of Mexico, and he was telling me, he says, we just can't keep up with this because every time there's a case, we have to go out there to ensure that we collect the evidence and what have you because they don't know how to do it. So that takes time away from what we're supposed to be doing. Yes.
Undercover work takes nerve and steel, obviously. Do you ever have any examples of being tested by the people you were dealing with? Say, you got to take these drugs to prove that you're not.
Oh, all the time, all the time. But when you're dealing with high-level drug traffickers, number one, they don't want to deal with users. Why? Because users are a liability, and when they get arrested and they start to go through withdrawals, they're going to give up their mother, their grandmother, their grandfather, their dogs, everybody. So they don't want to deal with people like that. But when I would deal with smaller drug dealers that I wanted to flip and get them to become informants, yeah, they would test me, but I would tell them, this is not for me, this is for somebody else, you want to sell it to me or not? But I got to tell you this story of when I was in Brazil and I was dealing with these Bolivian traffickers, and it was the son of the Minister of Justice under the Garcia Mesa regime in Bolivia. And he was married to a Brazilian woman. In fact, he used to be the Bolivian consul in Cuiabá, Brazil. And I met with him. I was introduced to him by an informant, and I was playing the role of a Mexican drug lord, but one that dealt in heroin, and I wanted to diversify into cocaine. So I met with him, and we started to negotiate for half a ton of cocaine. Eventually wanted to see money, didn't have any money. So it went back and forth, and, we need to see the money, And I said, listen, I've had it. I'm just going to go find somebody else. So what does he do? He gets greedy and he lies to his associates and tells them he sees the money. He's seen the money. The Brazilian Federal Police were able to get a finca or a ranch in Avare, which was about 4 hours outside of Sao Paulo, Brazil. And it was kind of interesting because I had about 25 Brazilian Federal Police in camouflage uniforms surrounding that whole area. We pick up this trafficker and we drive out there. And he says, well, where's your plane? The plane that brought the money. I said, well, I didn't want both planes to be at the same location. So we landed here, but we moved it someplace else. So he starts walking around the strip. And he's walking within a few feet of the Brazilian Federal Police. And I'm actually surprised he didn't step on somebody's head. And, you know, we waited there, and later in the afternoon, I could hear the hum of the engines of an aircraft. So he takes out a paper bag that he brought with him, and he removes his blue shirt, puts on a red shirt, walks out to the strip, or it was just a pasture, and the plane comes in really low and looks, and he lights a cigarette. And that was the signal that it was safe for them to land. So the plane circles around and lands. The plane is covered with cocaine. And we move in to make an arrest. And the bodyguard of his father was there. And he tries to he's going to pull the pin on a grenade. But you know, there were about 12 guns pointed at him, so, you know, he thought better of it and dropped the grenade. But those are the hair-raising stuff that you go through.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah. By the way, I've got more cousins here than I do in Espanola right now.
I almost called because of Mike, because I told you this guy was making fun of you. I'd like, if you could, to expand a little bit on your views on treatment. I still live in Espanola, and I see the generational youth that's there, and I'm just curious as to your views about federal funding for treatment for community medical.
Well, the thing is that Espanola has got to get more federal funding for treatment facilities. But like I said, you know, there's a methadone clinic in Espanola, but I'm not a big fan of those clinics because they're money-making enterprises. So they don't wean these people off methadone, okay? So they keep them on, they keep them addicted. And then you have these individuals, the drug addicts, that congregate in the parking lot, and then they start to sell other drugs like heroin and cocaine and what have you. So the treatment facilities and the treatment that is going to be provided has got to be better structured. Obviously, there's a greater need for treatment, not only in Espanola, but in many other areas. So the treatment has got to be part of that strategy. And the thing is, again, I go back and I can't harp on this enough, is that we need to start educating our kids in terms of staying away from drugs. I remember when I went to school in Espanola, I never saw a counselor ever. But, you know, they need to start getting people like me and others. And I want to give back to the community. I want to help my home state in terms of developing strategies to hopefully deal with the problems here. Because when it comes to teenage drug abuse here in New Mexico, we're third in the nation. Third in the nation, and in so many other areas that you almost have to say to yourself, you know, thank God for Mississippi, otherwise we'd be last. Sure, sure. Um, Actually, they're all my friends now. No, I'm just kidding. No, I'm just kidding. No, you know, people ask me, and I can honestly tell you that I was not afraid when I was working undercover, and I'm not afraid now. When I was working undercover on these operations, I was more apprehensive that the operation would not be successful than I was for my own safety. And the thing is that you almost, when you work undercover, and not everybody does undercover, but you have to be really calm because, you know, with these drug traffickers, if they see a bead of sweat or you stammer when you're talking, they'll kill you. So, you know, it's like being one of those old Western gunfighters that you just maintain your calm, and, you know, usually you would win, you know, every gun battle if you didn't get excited.
So give Mike a huge round of applause. We want to thank you guys for coming out and hearing a very beautiful lecture, very informative. We're going to have the exhibit open for another 5 minutes so you guys can look around. For those who didn't get a chance to look at it, you have some time to look at it. But other than that, thank you for coming down.
But again, you know, I thank you very much for your questions, the interaction, and thank you so much for coming and sharing this experience with me and so many others, and very much appreciated. And like I said, very proud to be from New Mexico.
Thank you.